On a quiet Saturday afternoon in September of 1979, a benefits consultant in suburban Pennsylvania sat alone in his office, working through a redesign of a retirement program for one of his bank clients. No ringing phones, no coworkers wandering in. Just a man, a stack of documents, and a copy of the Internal Revenue Code. Somewhere in that code was a brand new provision, a page and a half of dense legislative language that Congress had added the previous year and that almost nobody in the country had paid any attention to. It had been written to settle a narrow dispute about how executives deferred their bonuses. That was it. That was the entire intended purpose. But this consultant read that page and a half differently than everyone else. And the interpretation he sketched out that afternoon would go on to reshape the financial life of nearly every working American, redirect trillions of dollars into Wall Street, quietly kill off one of the great institutions of the 20th century, and transfer the entire risk of growing old from corporations onto the shoulders of individual workers. The provision was Section 401, subsection K, and the strangest part of this whole story is that for most of American history, the thing this tax code accident was designed to fund, retirement itself, barely existed at all. Let me take you back, because to understand what happened in that Pennsylvania office, you need to understand what came before it. And what came before it was, for most people, nothing. In 1880, roughly 3/4 of American men over the age of 65 were still working, not because they loved their jobs, because there was no alternative. The concept of retirement, this idea that you work for 40 years and then spend your final decades fishing, golfing, and spoiling your grandchildren, is not some timeless feature of human civilization. It's a modern invention, barely older than the automobile. In the 1800s, you worked until your body gave out. If you were lucky, you had a farm that your children could take over while you stayed on in a back room. If you were less lucky, you moved in with relatives and hoped they could afford to feed you. And if you had no family and no savings, you ended up in the almshouse, the poorhouse, a public institution that was essentially a warehouse for the elderly, the disabled, and the destitute. In the early 20th century, the single largest group of residents in American poorhouses was the elderly. That was the retirement plan. That was the safety net. A bed in a county institution and whatever charity the neighbors could spare. The first crack in this grim arrangement came, oddly enough, from war. After the Civil War, the federal government began paying pensions to Union veterans and their widows, and over the decades that program expanded until it became something astonishing. By the 1890s, military pensions were consuming somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/3 of the entire federal budget. Hundreds of thousands of aging men were receiving regular checks from Washington. It was, in effect, America's first mass retirement system. But it was limited to one generation of soldiers, and everyone knew it would die with them. The private sector's first move came in 1875, when the American Express Company established the first private pension plan in the United States. The terms tell you everything about the era. To qualify, you needed 20 years of service. You had to be at least 60 years old. You had to be physically worn out, and even then, your pension was half your salary, capped at $500 a year, subject to approval by the board of directors. This was not generosity. This was maintenance, a way to ease broken-down workers off the payroll without the public embarrassment of throwing them into the street. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad followed in the 1880s, and the pension idea spread through the industries that needed it most: railroads, banks, utilities, the companies large enough and stable enough to make promises measured in decades. And here's the detail that matters. These pensions were promises, not property. The money wasn't yours. There was no account with your name on it. There was simply a company's word that if you stayed 30 years, retired at the mandated age, and didn't get fired along the way, checks would arrive. Companies loved this arrangement because it chained skilled workers to the firm. Leave at year 29, and you left with nothing. Then the tax code got involved, and everything accelerated. The Revenue Acts of the 1920s made employer contributions to pension trusts tax deductible and let the money inside those trusts grow untaxed. Suddenly, pensions weren't just a labor management tool, they were a tax shelter. Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, AT&T, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, the giants of American industry all built plans. By 1925, roughly 400 pension plans covered about 4 million workers. But 4 million workers was a small slice of the country, and the Great Depression exposed just how fragile the whole arrangement was. Plans that paid benefits out of current earnings instead of built-up reserves simply collapsed when earnings disappeared. Elderly Americans were among the most visible victims of the 1930s, and out of that misery came the single most important retirement institution in American history, Social Security, signed into law in 1935. Payroll taxes started flowing in 1937, and in January of 1940, a retired legal secretary from Vermont named Ida Mae Fuller received the very first monthly Social Security check, $22.54. But here's what people misunderstand about Social Security. It was never designed to fund retirement. It was designed to be a floor, a guarantee against absolute destitution. The comfortable retirement, the one with the house paid off and the trips to Florida, was supposed to come from somewhere else. And for a few golden decades, it did. During the Second World War, the government froze wages to control inflation. So companies competing for scarce workers found another currency: benefits. Pensions became the sweetener you offered when you legally couldn't offer a raise. After the war, unions made pensions a centerpiece of collective bargaining. A 1949 legal fight involving Inland Steel confirmed that pensions were a mandatory subject of negotiation, and coverage exploded. By the late 1970s, 38% of private sector workers were covered by a traditional pension. If you worked at a big company or belonged to a union, the deal was simple and beautiful. Give the company your working life, and the company would fund your old age. A defined benefit, a specific check every month until you died. The company carried all the risk. If the stock market crashed, that was the company's problem, not yours. Now here comes the uncomfortable truth, the part of the story that the golden age nostalgia always leaves out. That beautiful promise was only as good as the company making it. And on December 20th, 1963, America found out exactly what that meant. That was the day the Studebaker Corporation, one of the most storied names in American manufacturing, a company that had been building vehicles since the wagon days of the 1850s, shut down its automobile plant in South Bend, Indiana. Shortly afterward, Studebaker terminated the pension plan covering its hourly workers, and the plan defaulted. The arithmetic of what happened next should have been front-page news for a year. The plan covered roughly 10,500 people. The 3,600 workers who had already retired got their full benefits, but around 4,000 active employees, people between 40 and 59 years old, averaging more than 2 decades of service, received roughly 15 cents for every dollar they had been promised. And nearly 3,000 younger workers got absolutely nothing. Imagine being 52 years old, having spent 23 years on an assembly line, having planned your entire future around a pension the company had promised you in writing, and watching 85% of it evaporate in a bankruptcy filing. There was no insurance. There was no federal backstop. There was no law that even required a company to set aside enough money to cover the promises it made. Studebaker became the scandal that broke the old system open. Senator Jacob Javits of New York took up the cause, introducing pension reform legislation in 1967. And after years of hearings, studies, and political trench warfare, Congress finally passed the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, which President Gerald Ford signed into law on September 2, 1974, Labor Day, fittingly. ERISA imposed funding standards, vesting rules, disclosure requirements, and created the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation to ensure pensions against exactly the kind of collapse that had destroyed the Studebaker workers. On paper, the traditional pension had never been safer. And that's the great irony of this entire story, because just 4 years after Congress finished building a fortress around the traditional pension, it accidentally created the thing that would replace it. The Revenue Act of 1978 was a sprawling piece of tax legislation, and buried inside it was that page and a half I mentioned at the beginning. Section 401K. Its purpose was narrow and technical, to clarify the tax treatment of deferred compensation, the arrangements by which executives could push bonuses into future years and delay the taxes on them. Congress was actually trying to rein in abuses, not launch a revolution. The provision took effect on January 1, 1980, and for 2 years, essentially nobody did anything with it. It was tax code wallpaper, which brings us back to that Saturday afternoon in September 1979, and the man in the Pennsylvania office, Ted Benna, a benefits consultant at a small firm called the Johnson Companies. Benna has always been honest about the myth versus the reality. He didn't discover a secret provision nobody else knew about. Plenty of benefits professionals had read Section 401K. What Benna did was something different. He asked a question nobody else had asked. What if this executive compensation provision could be used for ordinary employees? What if workers could divert a slice of every regular paycheck into a savings account before taxes and let it grow untouched until retirement? And then he added the second idea, the one that made the whole machine run, an employer match. Benna realized that lower-paid workers wouldn't participate in meaningful numbers just for a tax break. But free money from the boss? That changes behavior. Put in $1. Get something extra from the company. Nothing in the law required a match. Congress hadn't even imagined one. Benna layered it on top because he understood human psychology better than the people who wrote the statute. He pitched the design to his bank client. The bank's attorney turned it down. Too novel, too risky, never been done. So the Johnson Companies did something remarkable. They became their own test case, launching the first true 401k savings plan in the country for their own employees, effective January 1st, 1981. Later that year, the IRS issued rules blessing the use of regular payroll deductions, and the door swung wide open. In 1982, major corporations began piling in, and the growth from there was vertical. Within a couple of decades, tens of millions of workers were contributing. Today, 401k plans hold roughly $9 trillion in assets, and the 401k has become the default answer to the question of how Americans retire. But notice what happened along the way, because this is the part that rarely makes it into the celebration. Corporate America looked at the 401k and saw something even better than a benefit. An escape hatch. A traditional pension was an open-ended, decades-long liability that sat on the company's books and had to be funded no matter what markets did. A 401k was a defined contribution. The company chips in its match this year, and its obligation ends there. Cheaper, cleaner, predictable. So companies didn't add 401k plans alongside pensions. Over time, they swapped one for the other. In 1979, 38% of private sector workers had a traditional pension. Today, it's around 13%. The risk didn't disappear. It moved. Market crashes, bad investment choices, outliving your money, the discipline to save enough in the first place, all of it now belongs to you. Even Ted Benna, the father of the whole system, has spent his later years openly troubled by parts of his creation, lamenting the fees, the complexity, and the way his idea helped open the door for Wall Street to make even more money than it already was. So how did anyone ever retire before 1978? The honest answer is layered. Before the 1880s, mostly they didn't. They worked. Then they depended on family. Then they died. Then came a century of promises. Veterans' pensions, company pensions, Social Security, union contracts, each one an arrangement where some larger institution carried the risk of your old age. The 401k ended that century. It handed you ownership, portability, and the genuine possibility of building real wealth, things the Studebaker workers would have wept for. But it also handed you something else, the full weight of the outcome. Every paycheck, that small deduction, is a quiet referendum on a question America has never stopped arguing about: who should bear the risk of growing old? The company, the government, or you? A page and a half of tax code answered it, almost entirely by accident, on a Saturday afternoon when nobody was watching. If this story changed how you look at that retirement account balance, hit subscribe and drop a like on this video. We dig into the hidden systems like this every week, the invisible machinery that shapes your life in ways most people never think about. And there's another one of these threads coming soon that you will not want to pull on alone.